Growing up in a family business isn't all cash registers and customer smiles. It's early mornings, late nights, and knowing how to handle a shoplifter before you're even old enough to drive. I'm Amelia, and I've been the heartbeat of my folks' tableware store since I was a kid, slinging plates and cutlery instead of hanging out at malls. The day Mrs. Baker waltzed into our shop changed everything. She owned the bakery next door, and everyone knew her for her sharp tongue and even sharper business sense. I was arranging some fine china, the kind that's too fancy for everyday use, when I heard her heavy steps approaching. "Charlie," she boomed, never one to waste time on pleasantries. "Got a minute?" My dad, a man who never hurried his words, wiped his hands on his apron and nodded. "Sure thing, Barbara. What's on your mind?" They stepped into his cramped office, leaving the door slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of me, so I edged closer, pretending to fuss over an unruly stack of napkins. "I'm cutting straight to the chase, Charlie," Mrs. Baker said, her voice a mix of business and something else, something like excitement but sharper. "I want to merge our shops. Expand. Think about it, my pastries on your plates. It's a goldmine." I could almost hear the gears turning in Dad's head. He was cautious, always had been, but Barbara Baker didn't just throw ideas around. "And there's more," she continued, lowering her voice so I had to strain to catch it. "I think our kids should get hitched. It'll cement the deal. What do you say?" Hitched? To Mark Baker? The idea seemed ludicrous. He was nearly 30, and sure, not bad looking, but marriage? I barely knew the guy. Dad coughed, clearly caught off guard. "Well, that's quite a proposal, Barbara. Marriage is a big step. Come on, Charlie. It's not the dark ages. It's just good business. Think about it. I'll send Mark over later to meet Amelia properly." Before Dad could reply, Mrs. Baker was already halfway to the door. She paused, turning back with a grin. "Don't take too long. I know a good deal when I see one." As soon as she left, I barged into the office. "Dad, you're not seriously considering this, are you?" He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I know, kiddo. It sounds out there. But maybe just meet him? No harm in that, right?" I was about to argue more, but the look on Dad's face stopped me. He was worried, really worried, about the store, about us. So I nodded, feeling like I was agreeing to scout enemy territory. That evening, Mark came over. He was taller than I remembered. "Hi, Amelia," he said, offering a hand like he was at a job interview. "Heard a lot about you." "Good things, I hope," I replied, shaking his hand, feeling the calluses on his fingers. "Baker's hands. Yeah, your dad's a legend around here. And Mom, well, she thinks this could be great for us. For everyone." Mark and I started dating not long after his mother pitched the idea of merging our families and businesses. It felt like I was living in a sped-up romance movie, but Mark made the whirlwind feel okay. He was the kind of guy who knew exactly how to make a girl feel special, always opening doors, bringing small gifts, and making sure I was comfortable. Despite the bizarre circumstances that brought us together, I found myself genuinely liking him. A year flew by, and before I knew it, I was saying "I do" in a simple but beautiful ceremony. We got married, and with our vows, the two family businesses became one. The merge was seamless on paper, but in practice, it was all orchestrated by Mrs. Baker, my new mother-in-law. She was a force to be reckoned with, steering everything with a stern hand and an eye for detail. Right after the honeymoon, which was more of a working trip to food expos than a romantic getaway, she wasted no time remodeling the store. We knocked down walls and created one large space that fused the bakery with the tableware shop. The new layout included a cozy seating area where customers could sip coffee and sample pastries on the fine china we sold. "I want people to see how the dishes can come alive when they're used," Mrs. Baker explained one morning as we surveyed the construction. "Amelia, I expect you to not just sell these pieces, but to show them off. Serve the customers, make the desserts appealing, talk up the plates. They're selling a lifestyle, not just pottery." Yes, Mrs. Baker, I responded, tucking my hair behind my ear as I took notes. She had a way of laying out her vision that left little room for input, but it was hard to argue when sales began to double. Living with Mark's parents was another part of the merger I hadn't been too keen on. Mrs. Baker insisted it made financial sense for us to stay with them. Why waste money on rent when you need to be on hand to help out? The store's just down the street, she'd argued. It was practical, yes, but living and working together with no break was suffocating. One evening, as I was wiping down tables after a long day, Mrs. Baker walked over with a stack of dish towels for me to fold. "Amelia, dear, you're doing a fine job here, but remember, this is your life now. No need for that college degree. This," she gestured around the bustling store, "is better than any classroom." I bit back my frustration, the words tasting bitter. "I know, Mrs. Baker. Amelia," she cut in sharply, "focus on what's in front of you. This business will be yours one day. You and Mark, running it together. Isn't that enough?" I nodded, forcing a smile. The truth was, it wasn't enough. I missed my studies, the sense of working towards something that was just mine. But my new role left little room for anything else. Life in the store became a routine, a rhythm dictated by Mrs. Baker's unwavering command. Days blurred, but one thing became increasingly clear: my dad was around less and less. At first, I thought he was just taking some well-deserved time off, but then days turned into weeks without a single sighting of him behind the counter or in the office where he used to manage the books. One Sunday, I decided to visit my parents at home. The atmosphere was different, quieter. Mom was in the garden, and Dad was sitting on the porch, looking out with a kind of faraway sadness. "Hey, Dad," I said as I approached, trying to keep my voice light. "Haven't seen you at the store much. Everything okay?" He sighed deeply, the weight of his words ready to fall. "It's the merger agreement, Amelia. Barbara had her lawyers set it up in a way that pretty much cuts me out. I can't make any real decisions anymore, and I only get a tiny share of the profits." Frustration boiled over, and I stood up, pacing the porch. I can't believe she'd do this. "And Mark, does he know?" Dad's expression softened. "I don't think he sees the full picture, Amy. Barbara's got him thinking this was all necessary to save the business." The next day, I confronted Mark at the store, waiting until we were alone. "Mark, we need to talk about the merger. Your mom's cut my dad out completely. Did you know?" Mark was rearranging some pastries, but he stopped and straightened up, his face setting into defensive lines. "Mom did what she had to do. My mom saved our businesses, Amelia, turned it into something profitable. We're doing better than ever, aren't we?" "Profitable? At what cost, Mark?" My dad's been pushed out of his own life's work. He didn't have an answer, just turned back to his work, effectively ending the conversation. The divide between us had never felt so wide. The very next day, Mrs. Baker cornered me by the coffee machines, her voice sickly sweet. "Amelia, dear, I hope you're not causing trouble. We don't need any mutiny on this ship." I met her gaze, my frustration hardening into resolve. "I just want what's fair for my dad, Mrs. Baker." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that was more threatening than any shout. "Listen, girl, don't poke your nose where it doesn't belong. That agreement was signed and sealed with your father's consent. He knew what he was getting into. I suggest you focus on your job and leave the business decisions to those of us who know how to handle them." Walking away, I felt a mix of anger and helplessness. It wasn't just the business that was under her thumb, it was my marriage, too. Mark's words echoed in my mind, a mantra of profit over family. The pandemic hit us like a sledgehammer. One day we were buzzing with customers, and the next, the store was eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional echo of our footsteps. I remember standing in the middle of the empty store, the silence overwhelming. That's when the idea hit me. "Mrs. Baker, why don't we ramp up our online presence? We could start delivering. People might not come to us, but we can go to them." Mrs. Baker was rearranging a display that no one would see, lost in her thoughts. She paused, her brow furrowing. Online? Amelia, that's not how we've ever done things. But it's how things are now, I pressed, feeling the urgency. We need to adapt or we'll sink. We launched our online ordering system, and I took charge of setting up the delivery logistics. It was chaos at first, missed orders, delayed deliveries, but slowly, it found its rhythm. Before long, our sales began creeping back up, nearing pre-pandemic levels. Seeing the success, I was filled with a new kind of energy. Mrs. Baker, we should keep pushing this. Even when things go back to normal, this could be a new revenue stream for us. Maybe even specialize in custom confectionery orders online. Mrs. Baker was slicing bread, her knife hitting the cutting board with finality after each slice. Amelia, let's not get ahead of ourselves. We'll go back to normal soon, and this online fuss will be unnecessary. But Mark cut in, siding with his mother as usual. Amelia, we're just riding out the storm. Mom's right. People will want to come back in, sit down, enjoy the experience. This online thing is just temporary. The pandemic eventually receded, and true to Mrs. Baker's word, we returned to normal operations. The online delivery service was shut down, much to my dismay. I watched as our new online customers drifted away, their messages of thanks and requests for more deliveries going unanswered. I couldn't hide my disappointment. One evening, as we were closing up, I confronted Mark again. We're making a mistake, shutting down the online service. It was working. It was really working. Mark was counting the day's cash, not looking up. Amelia, the crisis is over, and we're going back to what we know best. This is my mother's business. She's built it from the ground up. We're not going to gamble with its future on a whim. Walking home that night, the streets quiet and the shop windows dark, I felt a deep sense of isolation. The rift between Mark and me grew wider with each step I took. It was one of those heavy, relentless rainy days that turned the world outside the store windows into a blur. I was tidying up the store hall, rearranging the chairs and wiping down wet tables when the door creaked open. A small figure stumbled in, her clothes soaked, her face streaked with tears. Hey, it's okay. You're safe here, I said, kneeling down to her level. Can you tell me what happened? Just then, Mrs. Baker came out from the back, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight. Amelia, what is this? Who is this child? We can't have beggars in the store. It's bad for business. Get her out. I was shocked, my stomach turning at her coldness. She's just a child, Mrs. Baker. She's scared and alone. Mark, who had been in the office, came to see what the commotion was about. His face mirrored his mother's disapproval. Mom's right, Amelia. We can't start letting street kids hang around. It sets a bad precedent. I called the police. Refusing to let the little girl shiver in the cold, I wrapped a nearby clean blanket around her shoulders and poured her a cup of hot chocolate, which she clutched gratefully, her small hands trembling. It wasn't long before the police arrived. After a brief conversation, they confirmed that the girl had indeed wandered away from her parents, who were frantically searching for her. They thanked me for keeping her safe and left to reunite her with her family. Once the police had left, Mrs. Baker turned on me, her face a mask of fury. Amelia, I'm docking your wages for today's disruption. And for the next 2 days, you're washing dishes to make up for the trouble you've caused. Mrs. Baker, that's not fair. I was just trying to help. Enough, she snapped. You want to run a charity, do it on your own time. This is a business, not a homeless shelter. That night, as I scrubbed pot after pot, my hands raw and my heart heavy, I couldn't help but think about how far Mark and I had drifted from the people we used to be. Every scrub of the scouring pad was a reminder of the love that had curdled into something unrecognizable under his mother's influence. I missed my life before the merger, before my dreams had been overshadowed by the harsh, unyielding world Mrs. Baker had created. More and more, I found myself dreaming of a way out, a path back to the person I used to be. A week after the incident with the little girl, the store was bustling with the usual Saturday crowd when a well-dressed man stepped in. He wore a sharp suit that didn't quite belong in our casual little shop, and his presence commanded immediate attention. I greeted him with a polite smile, leading him through our selection of fine tea sets, which he examined with an expert eye. "I'll take the complete set of these," he said, pointing to our most expensive porcelain. "And could you add a selection of pastries? It's for a special occasion." "Of course, sir," I replied, my hands carefully wrapping the delicate tea pieces as I packaged them securely. I then filled a box with an assortment of our finest pastries. He watched my every move, a thoughtful look on his face. As I handed him his purchase, he extended his hand, gripping mine firmly. "Thank you. You've been very kind. Actually, you showed kindness to my daughter last week. She told me how you helped her." I paused, surprised. "She's your daughter?" "I'm just relieved she's safe." The man smiled warmly, reaching into his jacket pocket and handing me a business card. "My name's Thomas Avery, and I'm a lawyer. If you ever need anything, feel free to call me." I glanced at the card, noting the law firm's name etched in bold. "Thank you, Mr. Avery. Actually, there might be something." "Oh?" His eyebrows lifted in interest. "It's a long story, but it involves a business deal made by my father that I think wasn't entirely fair," I said hesitantly. "Why don't you come by my office next week? We can look over the documents together," he offered, his tone sincere. I agreed, grateful for the opportunity. At home that evening, I was quiet during dinner, my thoughts swirling. Mark sensed my distraction. "What's on your mind, Amy? You've been off lately," he asked, his gaze sharp. I stirred my food around my plate, considering what to say. "Just tired, I guess." As I lay in bed later, the weight of my secret pressing down on me, I realized that telling Mark was not an option. He had chosen his side, and I had to choose mine. Mr. Avery was my chance to make things right, not just for my dad, but for myself. The following week, I met Mr. Avery at his office, a sleek, imposing building that made me feel out of place with its polished floors and stark modern art. Sitting across from him in the high-backed leather chair, I handed over the merger documents between my father and Mrs. Baker. Mr. Avery's eyes narrowed as he flipped through the pages. "There are several issues here," he said after a long pause. "The terms are unusually favorable towards one party. It's exploitative, and possibly even illegal, depending on the circumstances of the agreement signing." My heart pounded with a mix of fear and hope. "Can we do something about it?" He nodded. "I believe we can. I'll need to do some more digging, but I'm willing to help you pro bono, given the situation with your father." "Thank you, Mr. Avery." I paused, unsure how to express my gratitude. "Don't mention it. Let's try to set this right." Leaving his office, I felt a mix of exhilaration and dread. The thought of going against my husband and his mother was daunting, but the possibility of reclaiming my father's rights was too compelling to ignore. As I approached our house, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses filtered out to the driveway. I paused, the realization hitting me like a cold wave. Today was our anniversary. How could I have forgotten? I opened the door to a scene of festivity, our living room transformed into a miniature banquet hall, filled with friends and family, all seemingly in high spirits. I stepped in, trying to muster a smile, but before I could get my bearings, Mrs. Baker spotted me. "Amelia, there you are, wandering the streets when you should be here hosting," she bellowed, her words slurred by drink. "We're celebrating, in case you forgot." I stammered an apology, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room on me. "I'm so sorry, Before I could finish, Mrs. Baker's temper flared, and with a dramatic flourish that only a drunken mind could conjure, she hurled an empty ceramic plate in my direction. It smashed against the wall where my head had been seconds before. The room fell silent, the festive mood evaporating like mist. Mark staggered over to me, a glass of wine in his hand, his smile cruel. "Looks like you need to clean up, Amy. You're dirty as a beggar," he sneered, and then splashed the wine across my hands and down the front of my dress. The sharp, sweet smell of alcohol stung my nostrils as laughter erupted from Mrs. Baker. The room's atmosphere shifted, guests exchanging uncomfortable glances, their earlier merriment replaced by a tense silence. Something inside me snapped. "Enough," I said, my voice ringing clear and surprisingly calm in the suddenly quiet room. "I met with a lawyer today. I'm filing for a divorce, Mark." The words hung heavy in the air. Mrs. Baker staggered forward, her face contorted in a mix of rage and confusion. "Divorce? You ungrateful." "And I'm contesting the merger agreement," I continued, cutting her off. "There's been fraud, and it's going to be investigated. The documents have already been sent to the authorities and the courts." Mark's face went pale, his earlier bravado draining away. "You can't. Who gave you the right to?" "I gave myself the right," I shot back. "For years, I've been treated like a servant in my own home, pushed around and laughed at. No more." I turned to leave, but Mrs. Baker grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Amelia, wait. Let's talk about this. We can sort something out." I pulled my arm free, feeling a surge of empowerment. "Talk to my lawyer," I said, handing her Mr. Avery's business card. "From now on, any communication goes through him." I walked away then, up the stairs to our bedroom, their shocked and angry shouts fading behind me. Each folded shirt and tucked away photo a step closer to freedom. The trial began, and it was clear from the start that Mrs. Baker and Mark were on the defensive. Her lawyer tried to paint me as a conniving, envious woman who was out to ruin the family business out of spite. "Ladies and gentlemen," her lawyer began, his voice smooth and accusing, "Amelia here is driven by sheer envy. She has spun a web of lies, hoping to entangle an honest businesswoman and her son in her deceit." I felt a flare of anger but remained composed. Mr. Avery, my lawyer, was next to speak, and his calm demeanor reassured me. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that my client has acted not out of envy, but out of a need to correct a grave injustice. The merger agreement, which we will present, clearly shows manipulations and unfair terms that were hidden from Amelia and her father." As documents were presented and witnesses called, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew tense. Mrs. Baker and Mark tried to defend their actions, but their arguments fell flat against the solid evidence we had gathered. When it was my turn to testify, I stood, feeling every eye in the room on me. I respected Mrs. Baker and never would have imagined that family could treat each other this way. This isn't about jealousy. It's about justice for my father and for me, about reclaiming what was dishonestly taken from us. The trial lasted for days, but finally, the jury returned with their verdict. "Guilty of fraud," those words echoed in the courtroom, a sweet sound amidst the chaos of the past months. The judge then proceeded to annul the fraudulent merger agreement and imposed a significant fine on Mrs. Baker, along with an order for financial compensation. However, Mrs. Baker's finances were a mess, it turned out. She couldn't afford the monetary compensation. Instead, she was forced to cede her rights to the bakery to me as a form of payment. My father and I became the sole owners of not just the tableware store, but also the bakery that had been the source of so much strife. Back at the store, which now felt truly ours, my father hugged me, his eyes wet with tears of relief. "Amelia, you've done more than just win back our store. You've restored our family's honor." Mrs. Baker and Mark were now in a dire situation. With no bakery and no savings, they were forced to find other jobs. The community's support had shifted, seeing them for who they truly were, and they struggled to regain any standing. As for me, I felt a freedom I hadn't known in years. I resumed my college studies, each class a step toward rebuilding the life I had put on hold. Life at the store was bustling, better than it ever was. With the bakery's integration, we introduced breakfast combos, pastries with artisanal coffee served on our finest china. It was a hit. Dad ran the floor, his joy in customer interaction evident, while I managed behind the scenes, planning expansions and new product lines. "This feels right, doesn't it?" Dad asked one day, as we watched a family enjoy their breakfast at one of our new tables. "It does, Dad. It feels like us," I replied, my heart light, my gaze steady on the bright future we were building. Not just rebuilding what we had lost, but creating something new, something better, fortified by the lessons of the past and hopeful for the future.